All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Think of this as your ultimate structured study guide to absolutely crush those AO2 analysis and evaluation exams on deductive arguments for God. We're diving deep into the philosophy of religion today, specifically the infamous ontological argument, to see if philosophers can actually truly prove that God exists in reality. If you're looking to master how to weigh these arguments and defend against their critiques, well, you are in the exact right place.
Okay, here's our game plan for the explainer. First, the ontological timeline. Second, reason versus experience evidence. Third, deductive versus inductive arguments. Fourth, key arguments and critiques. And finally, number 5, the definition of God.
So, kicking things off with Section 1, the ontological timeline.
You know, this ontological argument doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It travels a pretty wild path through history. It all starts with St. Anselm way back in the 11th century. But as we move forward in time, it starts taking some serious heat. It faces heavy scrutiny from medieval heavyweights like Aquinas, and then eventually runs right into the incredibly sharp, skeptical minds of Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant. So yeah, this isn't just some dusty, dead theory. It's a massive, centuries-long intellectual battle.
Moving into Section 2, reason versus experience evidence.
Okay, let's get our terms straight. Thinkers like Anselm and René Descartes built their arguments a priori. What does that actually mean? Well, it means they relied entirely on the mind. They were analyzing concepts through pure logic and reason, rather than, going outside and actually observing the physical world. For them, the mind and the mind alone is the key to unlocking absolute truth.
But then, on the complete flip side, we have the counter approach, which is championed by the empiricists. This is called a posteriori. These arguments rely entirely on your 5 senses. Basically, if you can't see it, hear it, touch it, or measure it out in the real world, you can't prove it, period. This is actually the foundation for stuff like the cosmological and teleological arguments, which look out at the physical universe for their proof.
So what we're really looking at here is a fundamental, almost tectonic clash of worldviews. On one side, we've got the rationalists. They're banking on internal logic and innate ideas to figure out the truth. On the exact opposite side are the empiricists. They're arguing that all knowledge absolutely must come from sensory experience, flat out rejecting pure reason as a way to prove facts. You're definitely going to want to keep this clash in mind, because honestly, it's the engine driving every single debate we're about to look at.
Which brings us to Section 3, deductive versus inductive arguments.
The ontological argument is what we call a deductive argument, meaning its defenders are claiming it is a totally watertight, foolproof logical proof. We're not talking about what's probably true here. It claims that if you accept the starting definitions, the premises, then the conclusion that God exists literally must logically and necessarily follow. There's no wiggle room. When you put these two argument types head-to-head, it gets really interesting. Look at how a priori, deductive logic promises absolute 100% certainty. Sounds great, right? But the massive challenge it faces is that it relies purely on definitions, not reality. On the other hand, a posteriori, inductive arguments rely on our shared everyday human experiences. That makes them super relatable. But, and it's a big but, as David Hume loves to point out, our physical senses can be tricked, they can be mistaken, so they aren't flawless either.
All right, let's get into the good stuff. Section 4, key arguments and critiques. So here's Anselm's absolute foundational premise. God is the greatest possible being. To wrap your head around this, think about a painter for a second. A painter has an amazing idea for a painting in their mind. But once that painting actually exists on the canvas in reality, it's far greater, right? Anselm uses this exact logic. He argues that if God truly is the greatest possible being, it is inherently better or greater for him to actually exist in reality rather than just floating around as a concept in our minds.
Well, Ganilo, who surprisingly was actually a fellow monk and lived around the same time as Anselm, thought this was frankly kind of absurd. He used this brilliant analogy of a perfect island to basically ridicule Anselm's logic. He argued, look, just because you can imagine the absolute greatest, most perfect, ultimate island in your mind, that doesn't mean it magically pops into physical existence in the middle of the ocean. Now, to be fair, Anselm fired right back. He countered that God has necessary existence, meaning he literally cannot not exist, whereas an island is just contingent, relying on a bunch of other physical factors to exist. But even with that defense, Ganilo's island analogy is still a famous, massive hurdle for this argument.
Then enters the supreme skeptic himself, David Hume, who delivers a really crucial blow.
Because Hume is a hardcore empiricist, he argues that the statement, God exists, is what we call synthetic. All that means is that it requires physical external proof to actually be verified as true or false. You absolutely must step outside of the dictionary definition and go gather real, physical, sensory proof. And, well, since we can't physically see or touch God, Hume looks at the ontological argument and basically declares it a complete failure.
And Immanuel Kant? He adds another devastating blow with a very specific, famous phrase. He says, existence is not a determining predicate. Okay, a predicate is just a fancy word for a property or a descriptive quality. Kant is arguing that simply stating something exists doesn't actually add any new descriptive quality to our understanding of it. Telling me something exists doesn't change the actual definition of the object one bit.
You can see this logic perfectly in Kant's incredibly famous example of the 100 thalers. Thalers were just old German coins. Kant says, look, 100 imaginary thalers and 100 real physical thalers have the exact same definition. Slapping the word existence onto them doesn't change what they fundamentally are. But modern philosopher Stephen Davis actually fires back at this. He argues that, hold on, existence can be a real predicate. Why? Because real thalers have the added, tangible perfection of actual purchasing power in the real world. Imaginary coins aren't going to buy you a coffee. So, according to Davis, existing in reality really does add a concrete, undeniable quality to something.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, the definition of God.
It's absolutely wild when you look at how much these definitions vary from thinker to thinker. Anselm says God is the greatest possible being. Descartes says he's a supremely perfect being. Norman Malcolm calls God an unlimited being. But then Kant jumps in and points out that humans actually have no clear idea of what a necessary being even is, and we end up defining God mostly in negative terms, like what he isn't. Notice how this clash of definitions totally shapes the success of the argument. In fact, Aquinas very wisely pointed out centuries ago that because human beings hold such vastly different definitions of God, his existence is clearly not self-evident to everyone. Think about it. If this deductive argument was perfectly, universally strong, literally everyone would just inherently agree, and they definitely don't.
Which leads us to a pretty massive realization. What if these arguments are actually missing the point entirely? Let's take a step back. If we recognize that Anselm wasn't actually trying to prove God's existence to a stubborn atheist, it kind of changes everything. Anselm already had deep faith. He was simply offering a rational justification to someone who already believed. He was just trying to understand his own faith through the lens of logic.
And this right here, this is a massive paradigm shift. If you view God purely as an objective reality, well, of course you're going to demand deductive or inductive proof. But modern thinkers like D.Z. Phillips and Gareth Moore suggest something radical. God isn't an object to be physically proven in a lab at all. Moore actually compares belief to the equator. Think about it. The equator isn't some giant red line painted across the earth that you can go out and physically touch. It's a lived presumption. It's an organizing principle that we all use to navigate the world. In the same way, believers live their lives organizing it around the presumption of God, rather than trying to scientifically verify him like he's just another object in the universe.
So, as you gear up to analyze and evaluate these complex concepts in your exams, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. If you start your essay with a rationalist definition, the deductive proof looks absolutely flawless. But if you start out as an empiricist, the whole thing falls apart instantly. So tell me, does this entire centuries-old debate just come down to the sheer power of how we define our words? Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and use this explainer to build those ultimate top-tier arguments for your exams. Good luck!